Hello there, welcome back to another episode of Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and here we talk about all things cloud. Now, thank you for joining today. We are Wednesday today, and that means we are going live. Wednesday is normally our go live date. No, are we Wednesday? We are Wednesday. I'm losing all track of the days this week, and it's going well. It's going well. I'm already entertaining Shannon, who's waiting behind the scenes here to get going. So we are Wednesday. It is live stream day, folks. Don't listen to me. I know what I'm doing. We are talking today all about Azure and VMware. So I will be honest. If you've watched the channel for a while, you will know that I am very much an app developer by trade, an app developer by background. So when we talk about things like VMware, Hyper-V, virtual machines, that's where I start getting out of my kind of comfort zone, and I'm not really in my territory there. So this is going to be fun and exciting. I am certainly going to learn a lot, and I am very, very pleased today to be joined by Shannon Kuehn. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and we're going to introduce Shannon to the show here.
Hi.
Hey, Shannon, how are we doing?
I am doing well. I was going to mention, and it's one of the things that's hilarious. My last name is not pronounced Kuehn; it's pronounced Keen. And I don't know. Yeah, and I don't. We didn't talk about that, so I don't even take offense. I think people mostly know me as Shannon,
There we go.
who talks about Azure VMware Solution. But yeah, it's Keen. So I suspect at some point my family wanted to Americanize our last name and be less thought of as German. There was a weird sentiment when I think immigrants came over that they wanted to be more American seeming, but I feel like my family didn't understand phonetics because the U and the E really throws everybody off.
And especially me being a Welsh person, because with
Right.
Welsh we have like loads of strange vowels. So like a W is actually a vowel as well, which is really weird. We won't go there, but
Oh, I didn't know that.
yes.
I didn't know that.
So like a U in Welsh is like an I or an E kind of sound. So I guess, yeah, my Welsh brain translated it that way, so apologies for that. But there we go.
No worries. I meant to like follow up with you, but it's just things have been so crazy.
Oh,
Right,
good.
it's the end of the fiscal year at Microsoft, and so we're always scrambling this time of year to kind of close out of the year.
Absolutely, absolutely. So with that, maybe I guess we've started a few intros there. So you mentioned at Microsoft as well. You mentioned your name. So tell us a bit more about yourself, Shannon, before we get going.
Sure. So I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft, and I work in the cloud advocacy team. What we focus on in my smaller sub team, we focus on enterprise platforms and tools. And the biggest candidate that we could see and kind of latch ourselves onto was Azure VMware Solution. And so I spend a lot of my time talking about the actual product itself, all of the interesting integrations, and some of the tooling that you can bolt onto the service, because it's kind of like the achievement unlock that you'll get if you play a really hard video game. You know, if you're playing an Xbox game and you beat a really hard boss, you get achievement unlocked. Moving your Azure VMware solution or moving your VMware solution environment on-prem into Azure VMware Solution really is kind of that achievement unlocked. You get a little closer to the ARM APIs, and you can start to do more interesting things that's sometimes a little harder when it's more hybrid and you've got your environment still on-prem.
Awesome. And as I mentioned a bit earlier there, VMware, no idea. So I am ready to be educated today.
Nice. So that's kind of how I feel about development, right?
There
I
we
think
go.
you and I were on a live stream and we were joking about it, and I just say all the time that I play a developer on TV. Like I never did it professionally prior to Azure and needing to hit REST APIs, but I have morphed into this interesting role that sits in between infrastructure and app dev. So I get stuck a lot and I go find my app dev friends who always are great with demystifying the processes I'm trying to make more sense of. So it's an interesting world where there's more cross-pollination between those two, I guess, sides of IT, right? Developers and infrastructure folks are having to sort of meet in the middle now and build out environments for whatever customer they work for or whatever company they're a part of. So
absolutely. And it's huge. It's happening everywhere. Like even, I guess today's topic is really going to be infrastructure focused, but even taking that one longish word, infrastructure, infrastructure as code, right, is also then something that's coming into the realm of like operators, and we're seeing those lines blurring. It's really interesting.
Even more. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And then I've had to help out my developer friends with networking concepts
Oh,
or VM
yes.
concepts, or and then vice versa. I've had my developer friends teach me how to write for each loops, and things that like I didn't realize. The idea that I thought a for each loop, you had to have a single piece of logic in one for each loop. You couldn't have multiple pieces of logic. And so I used to struggle with writing scripts until one of my developer friends said you could put all your bits of logic into one for each loop, and I was like,
Mind
so
blown.
I'm always a big fan of meeting in the middle and
Mm,
and having good conversations.
absolutely. And I think that's what we're going to do today, right? That's
We
I'm going to be
are.
learning for sure. So, I'm no stranger to hearing about VMware. I'm no stranger to hearing about things like lift and shift and these kind of virtualization platforms as well. So maybe let's start at the beginning and think about VMware maybe compared with other platforms. Why might I start my journey on something like VMware to begin with? What's maybe the context there for maybe any of my dev friends who might be listening in as well?
Sure, sure. I feel like there's still this point that we aren't yet reaching system administrators on premises, right?
Mm,
I think Microsoft does a great job of meeting developers where they are. There's a number of SDKs, a number of new languages that are being rolled into the mix pretty regularly. However, there's still these sort of laggard customers, and it's not a bad thing. It's just they have so much that they're doing on-prem. They're maintaining their entire VMware infrastructure, keeping VMs up and functional, dealing with that full gambit of solutions that you have to maintain if you're owning everything on premises. So this is an opportunity for Microsoft to meet system administrators where they are versus forcing them to embrace IaaS or any of the Azure services when they're probably fighting some fires on premises, right? I often say technical debt hits everybody, and of course, my boss is always trying to tell me it's only debt if you realize it's bad for you. And there's so many customers that don't even realize that this mounds and mounds of technical debt is a bad thing, right? So this is an opportunity to kind of speed up that process and get your environment into Azure a little quicker without having to stall out or have everything be like for like, because as you know, cloud is very agile. It changes every, I don't know, I used to say it felt like every week, but I think it's about every 6 to 8 weeks or something different that gets announced or added on to existing services. And it's sort of hard to keep up. And if you wait for everything to be kind of like for like, you might be waiting for a while. So having a platform inside of Azure that runs your VMware environment just like it does on premises, that starts to alleviate that conversation and let it be less anxious,
mm.
right? You can focus on things being plugged into your Azure VMware solution environment that you would on-prem. So you can have, VM templates to speed up the build process. You can think about automation tooling. You can bring about the same kind of standard operating procedures and have that be part of Azure VMware solution without having to pick apart the different services of Azure. Because I think, if you talk to all these customers, you talk to folks in the community, people are at different states of embracing cloud. I think everybody realizes now cloud is here to stay, but then you've got these folks who didn't focus on it for
Yep.
years and they're sort of being forced to focus on it. So this is an awesome opportunity to take what you have, place it into Azure, and then you're not necessarily reinventing the wheel and you can skill up at a time that I think makes more sense to the company.
No, absolutely. And I like some of the things that you said in there around really that journey of where Microsoft has met developers where they are in the past, but thinking about the same for folks who've got maybe that VMware infrastructure and VMware investment
Yeah.
already. I could absolutely go ahead, for example, and take a lift and shift approach, use something like Azure Migrate and bring that over into VMs. But as you say, then I'm almost losing some aspects of what I've gained over the years of that VMware investment at that point because all of that knowledge, all of that operational know-how, I then have to learn almost the Azure way of doing it all, right? Because of the native Azure services. So that makes a
Right.
lot of sense. So that's number one
Yeah.
learning for me. Got it. Got it. Awesome.
And I think so. Let's do
Mm,
this. Let's see. So let me start with just a slide here.
sure.
So the actual environment itself, it lives on bare metal.
Mm,
So it's like the S series VM for SAP
yep.
that also lives on bare metal. And those bare metal nodes are allocated to you. They're
Gotcha.
not logically separate. So it's built by Microsoft, it's cloud certified by VMware, and it's an awesome partnership. I think, if you followed Microsoft and VMware over the course of time, they weren't always the best of friends, right? They had two competing products, Hyper-V and then vSphere. But now you're seeing the two companies work together, and it's a really great reality. You're seeing VMware build out specialists to help customers realize the value of Azure VMware solution, and you're seeing dedicated teams at Microsoft to help make that be a reality. So, you're able to run the VMware workloads in Azure, and then if you've got support issues, right? Let's say something happens. I think of this environment as sort of in between IaaS and PaaS, right?
Mm.
It's sort of a PaaS version of a VMware environment. So you get those three nodes, and you're not really on the hook for management and maintenance and patching. Microsoft is. So the interesting part about that is, you're on the hook for the VMs that live inside of AVS.
Gotcha.
So there might be a situation where you need to call somebody for support. Something may not be working right. And so Microsoft works with VMware to give you resolution. You don't have to worry about trying to call Microsoft and VMware. You call Microsoft, Microsoft will troubleshoot the Azure components, figure out if it's an Azure related issue. And if it isn't Azure related and it's something vSphere related, then Microsoft goes and gets VMware involved. So it's an interesting support structure. But you're able to manage and secure your applications across VMware environments in Azure with that consistent operating framework.
Nice.
So it's an interesting reality kind of on that front.
Nice.
You're not having to worry about, oh gosh, my power supply failed, or oh gosh, I have to patch this server, or oh, we have to think about an upgrade because we're on a server or like an operating system OS version of vSphere that won't be supported in like 2 or 3 months' time, right? Microsoft starts to handle all of that for you.
Gotcha. It makes complete sense. I think when you look at maybe even services like Azure Kubernetes service, for example, there are some similarities I can see between the two there. For example, like, I don't have to go and spin up my own Kubernetes cluster from scratch using virtual machines, for example. Instead, I can let Microsoft go and, worry about the overhead of managing that. But then, yes, some of the periphery of what I need to go and manage with that cluster, I still need to take ownership of. But I can really start to focus in on how I enable the workloads then that run on top of that. It makes complete sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's do this, because I think this one is a really great slide, and it's something I tend to talk a lot about, right? So we often focus on the shared responsibility matrix as it relates to IaaS versus PaaS versus SaaS. This is the shared responsibility matrix for Azure VMware solution. And I think it really hits home the idea that you don't have to focus on hardware failures, because inadvertently it always happens at like 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. when you're trying to sleep, right? Being on call is not a fun reality. And how much cooler is it that Microsoft will handle that for you? I personally think that if this was around 10 years ago, I would have just said there's no reason to have physical servers anymore, right? Have Microsoft handle that. They're fully staffed 24/7, 365, regardless of where you are in the world. So Microsoft will handle all of the hardware failures, any sort of upgrades, any sort of version upgrades, patching. Microsoft will handle the critical patches as well as the regular patching that has to happen with ESXi. And then Microsoft maintains NSX-T. So there's different layers here, right? There's a compute layer, there's a networking layer, and there's a storage layer. The compute layer is essentially your bare metal nodes that you wind up getting, those 3 nodes, and that's just the minimum deployment. You can always have more. The recommendation is to run Azure Migrate in your environment. Azure Migrate will give you that idea of how many nodes you need for the VMs that you're running on premises, but the minimum is 3 nodes. So I'll often say 3 nodes to start, especially if you're just trying to figure out how to make sense of this service running in Azure. Then you've got the networking layer, which is handled by NSX-T. Can't exactly remember what NSX stands for, but just know it's the networking layer.
Sure.
It's still a little early. Oh, actually, I guess it's not that early. It's early enough though that I'm like, ugh, I haven't thought about it. So, so yeah, and you know what's crazy too is it's showing my taskbar here. Let's see if I can actually, I'll leave it. It doesn't matter. But normally I got to figure out why it's not. Just
not getting rid of that.
Awesome slide. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's going on there.
Windows is there like, I still want to take center stage here.
Right. So right? Let's do this.
There you
There we
go.
go. There we go. That's what I was trying to highlight here is the customer
Mm.
responsibility. So Microsoft will handle all the networking components as well as NSX-T was something where customers they may have embraced it, they may not have embraced it. It's sort of a mixed bag because customers do so many interesting things on premises with their networking infrastructure. So that's the software-defined networking layer of a software-defined data center or an SDDC. So even if you see this running on Google or AWS, it's still using NSX. So Microsoft will handle that for you, right? At least keeping everything up and functional. There's segments you have to be involved with, and that's more so east-west routing
Yep.
versus north-south routing, but that sort of makes sense if you think about what needs to talk to what. But Microsoft's on the hook for the bigger parts of this, as well as identity management, keeping the portal up and functional. And then your storage components are vSAN. So it's a virtual SAN running the storage infrastructure inside of Azure for you.
Nice.
So Microsoft's on the hook to make sure that that's up and functional. There's a little bit of configuration you have to adhere to. The
Sure.
big piece there is just to make sure that you're not over allocating on your storage space. So vSAN does require about 20% free at any given time. Just those are the rules that VMware built with VMware Cloud Foundation, and that's the software suite that runs this inside of Azure.
Okay. No, it all makes sense again. And I was doing a bit of maths, and I know it's very rudimentary maths here, but looking at all of your blocks that you have on screen, the different layers, etc., and 2/3 effectively of all those blocks are taken up now by things that are Microsoft
Right?
responsibility. And when you think of that, right, just going to the cloud and saying, okay, you can take all of that work, and we'll just focus on this bit over here.
Yeah. And I think this starts to change conversations for customers too, because I think a lot of system administrators have struggled to bring about automation in their
Mm,
environments. So they haven't thought about configuration management. They haven't even thought about automating their server builds outside of maybe having a VM template, because you can build those inside of vSphere. But sometimes customers haven't really thought about that full blown end to end configuration management or build
yeah,
process. So when you start to take away some of the pain points, and you start to give the lines of control over to Microsoft to help you with that burden of responsibility, you can start to think about more innovative ways of bringing about interesting technology into your existing environment.
yeah. No, absolutely. And I like it. I'm convinced. You know, if I was running my own VMware platform, I'm not sure why I'd be carrying on.
Yeah, right, right. And it's one of those things where it's a pretty compelling story if you think about the fact that it's an interesting partnership. There's pieces of it, just like with IaaS or PaaS or SaaS, that the cloud provider has to, or the cloud provider has to take into consideration. You are now focused on more ways of innovating what you're doing, which is always helpful
Absolutely.
because I feel like, you know, and all the customers I've helped, I don't work at the customer, right? I don't know what their day to day is like. Only they know it. I'm trying to make them more successful and to embrace cloud to help out with some of those realities so that they don't have to be on the hook for everything. And so it's another unique opportunity to see a tool come in that would help you out in terms of being able to keep your operational best practices and keep your environment up and resilient and online.
Gotcha. So I guess that at this point, I'm convinced, you know, I'm a operator on premises. I run my infrastructure. At this point, maybe I'm starting to think, okay, I'm kind of interested. What does this thing actually look like? Because, you know, you've mentioned, for example, that a lot of the operational things that I've been doing already don't particularly change so much. You know, I can bring some of that with me that I've got. So how does that maybe translate into some of the tools I might use, the Azure portal, all of these kind of things there?
Sure. So if you're familiar with VMware, VMware has a PowerShell commandlet library. It's just called PowerCLI.
Oh,
That works with Azure VMware Solution. There's a Terraform provider.
nice.
It also works with things like Ansible or Chef or Puppet, any of those, or even Salt Stack.
Hmm.
So if that's in your environment, you could bring that in without having to think through learning IaaS out the gate, right? Because essentially this is VMware inside of Azure. It's not like it's a nested hypervisor. I think that's the piece I wanted to hit home on, just because of the fact I think people always feel like this is a nested virtualization living in the Azure Service Fabric, and that is so not the case because it's dedicated to you. It's running vSphere, it's running ESXi on those bare metal nodes, and then when you go through the process of building it in the portal, a handful of additional VMs wind up getting built out, namely vCenter, NSX-T. There's a product called HCX, which is Hybrid Cloud Extension. That is the piece that helps you think about migrating your VMs on premises into Azure VMware solutions. So, if you talk to customers who have embraced IaaS prior to Azure VMware Solution kind of being around, they had to lean on tooling like Azure Site Recovery, or there's a number of these third-party tools to get a VM into Azure. Now you can build out Azure VMware Solution, unify everything from a networking perspective, and I can showcase some of how that looks like. Once that networking topology is linked via ExpressRoute, you can then enable hybrid cloud extension on top, and that enables a tunnel from on-premises into Azure where you could use vMotion. And vMotion is the tried and true technology of moving VMs around from vCenter instances, right? So you can think about taking that VM using HCX to migrate that VM using vMotion on premises into Azure, which it's mind-blowing because you don't have to think about downtime. You could do a live vMotion.
Nice.
So if I had a server that was mission critical, I really don't get a lot of great change windows to do anything to that server. You could migrate it into Azure VMware Solution using HCX with vMotion and do a live migration where there is no downtime.
Gotcha.
Which is extraordinarily compelling if you think about the fact that it's, there's resiliency that's always been built into VMware, and now you can think about extending that tooling into Azure.
No, that's really compelling, and I think the thing I guess I picked up on a bit earlier, but let's really pull it out here as well, is I think when we think about, or at least a lot of the migrations I've been involved in the past, a lot of them were, as you rightly mentioned just there, Azure Site Recovery, using it in maybe not the original intent of where Azure Site Recovery is kind of there, but it worked, I guess. Then eventually moving on to things like Azure Migrate, and that tooling has really come on a long way as well. But I think those two in particular are really, really well suited to where you're going and pointing virtual machines, whether they're Hyper-V, bare metal, VMware, for example, and pointing them towards virtual machines that will now live on Azure itself. So, the underlying Azure fabric. Whereas what we're talking about here is actually not really thinking about the Azure fabric of running your VMs, but actually just having your VMware platform, your VMware solution hosted in a data center, which happens to be where Azure is. It's slightly different nuance there, right?
Right. So I think let me do this. I'll showcase the architecture.
Yeah, cool.
Because I feel like this is something where we could dig into this a little bit more. So, and I think you could probably see my mouse here. So over here we've got kind of the AVS network. Cool. Think of this as also the AVS environment, right? So it's self-contained. It sits on bare metal nodes. The only way to be able to access that environment is to lean on the ExpressRoute circuit that comes with these solutions. So let's say we're talking about a minimal deployment, right? Or the bare minimum deployment. You get 3 nodes plus an ExpressRoute circuit. That ExpressRoute circuit, just like the S-Series VM for SAP, has to be peered into the Azure VNet. Nice. And that's what sort of helps you be able to unlock all of the interesting integrations, right? The achievement unlock, where you're closer to be able to integrate with Azure Security Center, Azure Active Directory. You could think about leaning on application gateways where you didn't have that functionality if you were living in hybrid, right? You could think about API management gateway in front of your VMs if you were building out more sophisticated ways of your thinking through your environment, because it's not just infrastructure focused. There's interesting, unique ways of building out infrastructure that also helps your developers out. So your developers who have been clamoring for cloud, they could also take advantage of this. And you could think about leaning on PaaS services once everything sits a little closer to the ARM APIs. So this, winds up getting peered into an Azure VNet. And the big piece here is, if you're doing a migration thread, you're taking a bunch of VMs from on-prem and you're migrating it through to AVS, you need your own ExpressRoute circuit, right? And that's just because you want a backed SLA from VMware. VMware will back an SLA if you're migrating your VMs over an ExpressRoute circuit that's privately peered into Azure. And then remember, you have to enable global reach. So in order for east-west traffic to route between 2 ExpressRoute circuits, you do need global reach, but it's fairly straightforward to at least enable. It's really up to the customer though, because you do introduce BGP. And I always feel like that's a non-trivial task. So the big, I think, pieces to pay attention to is if this is something that makes sense for your environment, pay attention to the networking sides of it, because I feel like that's where most customers get tripped up. We do have Microsoft Teams that can be kind of enabled to help. So Fast Track, the Global Black Belts, those are Microsoft folks that can help. Plus, we also have a pretty vast Microsoft partner ecosystem, and they have to go through certification each year to be able to help customers out. But if you're taking this on and you don't even want to deal with Microsoft consultants or any of the partner consultants, just factor in the networking piece, because I always feel like that's the hardest thing, right? Introducing BGP to an environment that may not necessarily have it might be a little bit of trial and error, potentially some experimentation. And so I always encourage it, especially if this is something that makes sense.
Absolutely. And something I was just looking at in the background here, you mentioned about express routes with global reach there as well. It just stuck in my mind that I'm sure I saw an update about it recently, and just to call out for anyone listening, as of the 1st of June, there will actually be a price reduction for global reach as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I saw you post that. I thought I liked it, but I still am playing catch up. I think what I need to do is not, like we were just joking prior to starting the live stream, that I need to not take time off this time of year because it's the end of the year for Microsoft.
Hmm.
So it's been a little crazy coming back. But I do remember that you posted that, and I had missed that announcement.
Mm,
So it's always interesting to see some of the announcements that go out, right? So the Azure blog is a fantastic spot, plus all the service updates,
absolutely.
that happen on a daily basis. So those are two great spots to learn more. And it is an add-on. It's not something that you would get necessarily just by having
Yeah,
ExpressRoute, but enabling it now is a cheaper reality, or at least a less expensive reality for customers who are thinking about a migration pattern into Azure.
gotcha. No, this makes sense. I hadn't really appreciated that, the requirement really for global reach and how that played into things. So yeah, that architecture now makes a lot of sense. This is something that we really need as a prereq to actually enable that migration and enable that piece to happen there. So got it. Makes sense. Cool.
Yeah, and I mean, if you didn't have an ExpressRoute circuit and you were waiting on it, there is an opportunity to think about a site-to-site
Hmm.
VPN.
That was my next question. Nice segue.
Free express route testing, right? You're trying to build out the sort of muscle memory of what it's like to take a VM on-prem and migrate it all the way through. It does require a vWAN hub and to deploy the vWAN, because you still need that east-west traffic routing, and that's sort of a hub that'll take your VPN site to site plus your express route circuit and route traffic through for you. So that's the big differentiator. But just remember that, if you're migrating your production machines and something decides to not work right, VMware won't necessarily back that SLA. So just keep that in mind, right? But this is awesome for POCs. This is awesome for MVPs. If you're trying to just spin this up in your environment, a lot of customers will choose this first because it sometimes takes some time to get express route circuits. I never know why, but if I could figure that one out, I suppose I would have a lot more, maybe wave a magic wand or something. I
Absolutely.
wish it was that simple, but it's always dependent upon where the customer is with their transition into a cloud-based platform like Azure. They may not necessarily have an express route circuit. So it's a matter of getting involved with your telco vendor of choice and then trying to figure out the right way to peer that into Azure. But it's a great value add once you have it, because then that's dedicated fiber to you and you're writing more of the Azure backbone. Whereas if it's a site-to-site VPN, you're leaning on an IPsec VPN tunnel that sits on your outbound network going out of your on-premises environment. So you're competing with other traffic. Now it is encrypted, but you're competing with other traffic, which is not always ideal.
Yeah, and I guess reiterating that point about the production migrations, right? I think something like this makes sense where you want to try things out, kick the tires while you're in that holding pattern phase. But if you need to have those guaranteed SLAs, that guaranteed performance, especially with those very critical workloads that you mentioned earlier, where you can do the live migration approach, no brainer that you need to have the right bandwidth pieces in place, the right connections from the express route perspective to go and make that happen. Makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's one of those things too, where folks don't quite realize all of the upfront network planning, right? So the same rules apply. You don't necessarily want an overlapping IP address space inside of Azure.
Yep.
And what's interesting, so let me go back a slide here. So the network that's built out for AVS is like a management network. It's a /22 CIDR address block, and that's the minimum. You can make it be larger if you want it to be. But this is an IP address range that's only used by AVS. You peer it to an Azure VNet. So that peering is how the environments down here would know how to, kind of get all the way into AVS. But the IP address range inside of AVS is only used by AVS, which was a little weird one for me to even go through because my background, while it's heavy in infrastructure, I always had a networking counterpart that would understand all of the routing and all of the switch configuration, right, and the firewall configuration. I've had to learn a lot more about networking, especially supporting this product.
Yeah.
And so when I first built this out, I was like, wait a minute, where does this environment show up? And then I'm reading through more of the documentation, and it's literally that linkage, that peering into an Azure VNet express route circuit. That's how everything's able to start to see each other because, the underpinnings of an Azure virtual network, once it's all stood up, it sort of just knows how to route to where it needs to route.
Gotcha. No, it makes sense. So then I guess the Azure VNet that's on the left-hand side there, just to make sure I understand in my head what's going on.
Yep.
Would I potentially be deploying things you mentioned like the API management a bit earlier on? Is it those kind of resources that might work with or depend upon the virtual VMware solution piece there then?
Yeah. So any of the PaaS services that require a dedicated subnet where it's kind of injected into the VNet, you would deploy it in here. But because of this linkage,
Gotcha. I'm with you.
It would be able to be seen and accessed by a VM in here. So if you had a legacy app that, because it takes time to unravel what we've done for the last 20 to 30 years in terms of IT, right?
Yep.
And it's just because things have shifted and evolved, right? So some of the ways of building these big, ginormous, monolithic apps are starting to sort of phase out, but it's not an overnight sensation. It takes some time to pick apart the services. And so if you pick apart an API management gateway, or you pick apart, if you wanted to stand up a WAF, or you wanted to stand up anything that on the PaaS front that requires some sort of dedicated subnet, you would place that in the Azure VNet itself, but it would still be able to be accessed by a VM that was deployed in here.
Gotcha.
Which is pretty cool.
Makes complete sense. Cool. I've got the picture.
So I want to talk a little bit about the hardware and software packages next. So I talk about this in the sense of, I think if anybody's a VMware admin who's watching right now, these shouldn't feel unfamiliar, right? This is fairly current. It's essentially n-1 of what is current. So what's currently out there and customers are starting to kind of migrate to it is vSphere 7.0. Now, we're going through testing and validation, and this will change as time unfolds. We're not going to always be on 6.7, right? But if you were looking at this solution and you were on an older vSphere version, which is predominantly what we wind up seeing, you wind up getting that upgrade it's a commitment to Microsoft, but you're not on the hook for that upgrade. So long as you're running a compatible environment, you could migrate an older vSphere version into vSphere 6.7 within AVS pretty easily. Now, and I some heavy caveats there, right? Again, it's the networking side of things that's a little tricky, but that can always be realized with help from Microsoft or help from a Microsoft partner. Those are the folks that tend to know how this winds up working best for customers. So that's why there's a lot of pre-planning that happens prior to anything even being spun up inside of an Azure subscription. But yeah, so it's ESXi, vCenter, vSAN, NSX-T, and HCX.
Yep.
So vCenter is sort of the brains of the operation. It's, if you're familiar with Hyper-V, it's SCVMM. You need some sort of centralized server that's able to understand what's in the environment, where the ESXi hosts are, how that storage is performing. That's where all your alarms will show up. So that gets deployed on behalf of the solution. And then HCX Advanced right now is the version that gets deployed with AVS. HCX allows for a handful of what are called site pairing. Now, remember, there was that tunnel that gets established between on-premises and Azure, and that's done by deploying HCX. The advanced license only allows for 3 site pairings. So if you have a pretty globally distributed infrastructure set, and you're thinking about relinquishing all of the sites and having them land on various instances of AVS, you may have more than 3 site pairings, and that's where HCX Enterprise would come into the mix. So that allows for up to 10 site pairings, and that's just up to 10 tunnels that need to be established into AVS during that migration pattern.
Gotcha.
So wanted to throw that out there.
With you.
And it's publicly available in preview. What that means is pricing has not been considered just yet, or it's in consideration, meaning it hasn't been publicized. Once it reaches full-blown GA, you'll get an announcement. Let's say you decide you want to go with HCX Enterprise while it's in public preview. You won't be charged for it. So once it reaches GA, though, you'll get notice well ahead of time that it's reaching GA on X date, and you can choose to just opt out. So customers are realizing that maybe they need it and they're in the middle of a migration path and they're actually done with maybe 4 or 5 of the sites that they've established site pairings to, and they can reduce it back to an advanced license key. There's flexibility there.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
And then the hardware specifications. So right now it's just one SKU. It's the AB36 SKU. And these are kind of the specifications that come with it. And you can see it's got a lot of compute, a lot of storage, a lot of networking throughput. So that gets deployed on behalf of you, right? You're not racking and stacking the equipment. You're not connecting it into a switch. Microsoft is doing it by way of you opening up a support ticket, and you have to get your subscription whitelisted, and that's just for capacity management, right? If we allowed you to spin up an AVS instance the same way that you go spin up a VM or a SQL Server or something like that, we would probably not be doing so well. But it's more of an ordered process in the sense that you would open up support ticket within a short period of time. I feel like it's like a day or two. I think we say up to 5 days, but it's literally within about a day or two, you get response back from the capacity management teams, and then they'll whitelist that subscription and you'll just go register the resource provider and boom, it's up, it's live in your environment. So at some point, I suspect we will have additional models. We don't at this point in time, but I feel like this story will continue to evolve. So if you were to look at this right now, this is everything you would wind up getting with your AVS instance.
Yeah, and I was just while you were explaining about that there, Shan, I was looking at the pricing page as well, and just looking at like the different regions, and there's pretty good regional coverage as well. I was thinking with something which is so not bespoke, that's kind of the wrong word here, but you know, that process you got to go through, it's pretty well covered.
Yeah, and I know there's more certifications that are happening for additional regions too. So stay tuned, because this is going to be expanding more than so we had a first iteration of this, and it was AVS by Cloud Simple. This is just called Azure VMware Solution, or AVS. This is our second go around with the service, and it's a first party service. Cloud Simple was kind of the vendor that we chose to help align the first iteration, and we still have customers who are on Cloud Simple. So if you see a SKU that's out there with the C in front of it, that's a Cloud Simple SKU. So if you wind up getting your environment ready to go and you deploy the Cloud Simple SKU on accident, still an opportunity, or you might see it in the Azure pricing calculator. That's where you'll see the Cloud Simple stuff still show up, because it's still around. We still have customers that are on it. But the kind of net new customers, we want them on the iteration of AVS that GA'd at Ignite last September.
Gotcha. Looks good.
And I think like the other little piece of info here is, it, like I said, it requires a minimum of 3 nodes per vSphere cluster. You've got a maximum of being able to run 16 nodes on a vSphere cluster. And then you can have up to 96 nodes in an Azure private cloud instance. That's a crazy amount of compute, storage, network throughput, et cetera. And so, we really are trying to target a lot of different sized customers as well.
Yeah, I built my own PC rig towards the tail end of last year, and it's put to shame with some of those specs. So we'll leave that one there. But what would be cool is maybe if we could shift gears a bit and maybe look at the portal and just see how some of this translates, for example. Because I guess we've been hinting at, I guess the service itself works slightly differently, because it's not quite, you don't spin the resources up in the same way. So I think just for the listeners and the viewers, might be good to maybe compare and contrast and see what that looks like.
Sure. So I will walk through how easy it is to spin this up. I feel like if I ever saw this in a previous life, I probably would have lost it because it's extraordinarily straightforward. Grab it, right? And this will give you a nice overview, talk you through the different consumption models, the data processing agreement. I always feel like this is a great one to take a look at. This is where you see the plans, right? Bare metal. So if you're curious to explore more, there's some info here you could read a little bit more on. So it's as simple as clicking on create. Now I already have this deployed in the subscription. It does take about 2.5 to 3 hours to deploy. So I won't actually be able to deploy it, but if I didn't have an environment in this subscription, that I wouldn't have this red little bit of text here. And
Sure.
basically what this is saying is it's available for all customers with an existing enterprise agreement or those that fall underneath the cloud solution provider Azure plan. So prior to creating and deploying your Azure VMware Solution Private Cloud, please review the following process for node allocation to your subscription type here. So if you click on that, it takes you into our documentation.
Nice.
So you don't have to sort of navigate with blinders on, like, how do I actually do this? No, we actually have it documented and we have it linked to. So let's say you missed the process of opening up that support ticket. This link will take you to the actual publicized way of getting this going within your environment. And then it also talks about registering the resource provider down here. So that takes you to the next little bit of info that you need in order to deploy it.
Nice.
So I'll flip back here. I will just pick this because I'm not actually going to kick it off.
I mean, we
But
could
the
stream
instance
for
that
2.5, 3 hours. I mean,
it's going to be the most boring stream ever. We're going to have to like resort to like, I don't know, dad jokes, knock knock jokes, right? So let's just call this so EPT is my short term for enterprise platforms and tools. We'll just call it SDDC. Now, if I didn't have this deployed, the SKU would drop down and you would see the AV36 SKU. It's already deployed, so it's hard to kind of show it. And let's say I had 4 nodes or 5 nodes. You could move this slider bar up or down. And this is where you would type in the management address. So let's do 10.20.0.0/22.
and that's that block that was on the right-hand side of the diagram.
Correct, that
Nice.
only AVS uses.
Gotcha.
And then you can choose to tie it to a VNet right here.
Mhm.
It has to have a gateway subnet. This is for the express route termination to happen. I won't be able, like I said, to deploy it,
Sure.
right? But see, it says here, only virtual networks with a valid subnet with the name gateway subnet are available for the selection.
Yep.
And so when you spin this up, Microsoft or the build process will automatically peer that express route VNet or that express route circuit into your Azure VNet without you having to do it. Now, let's say you're a customer that already has express route, you can leave this blank too and configure the peering after the fact. So I always mention that just because of the fact that there's people at various different degrees of cloud adoption, right? So if you're brand new, I recommend filling this out because it's one less step that you have to worry about. But if you have an existing express route circuit and you are doing stuff in Azure, leaving that blank is probably going to be a good bit of info for you, just so that you can plot out the right way to connect everything. Because let's say you might have a different VNet that you want to peer this to, or you might have a situation where you want this to go to a specific express route SKU or express route circuit. So leaving it blank is not a bad thing. But look at here. So the next here is tags, or I can go to review and create.
Yep.
How straightforward is that? I fill out a couple of fields and then I kick off the 2.5, 3 hour bit and I have an environment that's up and functional. I mean, like, I can't tell you how long vSphere upgrades or migration patterns or patching or even getting virtualization into some of my environments took prior to it. Would be months. It wouldn't be hours. So this is speeding up the process pretty significantly.
Love it. And the amount of power that you get just from that simple page, right?
Right?
That's awesome.
And you can also export the template. So if you are ARM template savvy, you can go that route. You can also build it out with AZCLI.
Nice.
There's a PowerShell commandlet library, as well as you can even lean on Terraform. I have yet, it's on my docket to go play around with Bicep in general, but I wanted to figure out if you could even think about Bicep for this as well. So if anybody in the realm of, I guess, cloud families out there listening, if you're interested and you're more savvy than I am with Bicep, feel free to connect with me on Twitter or even LinkedIn, because maybe we could figure out a way to have something with Bicep kind of go out to the broader community, because I feel like more and more folks are turning that direction, wouldn't you say, in terms of what
Absolutely.
you've
Absolutely.
so
I'm
I feel like it's possible, but I haven't had enough time to focus on it.
Yeah, I'm now intrigued and already looking at the Bicep GitHub repo and trying to piece together what can be done there. So maybe we'll have an
Yeah,
answer by the end of the stream.
yeah, there you go, right? And I imagine it wouldn't be really crazy in terms of the length of template,
No.
because you're literally going to deploy the AVS resource, and then 2.5 hours later, you might be adding other resources, but that's something that could easily be better served by a separate template. Because as you know, if you spin it up and you run the verbose flag, you're only going to get info for the first hour. If you run it as a job, you could go back and check on it, but you're kind of at the mercy of waiting for the ARM APIs to finish that process of full configuration,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, absolutely.
So let's go into an actual software-defined data center. Let's go into the environment that we have within advocacy.
Sounds good.
So it looks just like every other Azure resource, right? In
Hmm.
fact, it's very much so hit on by the top handful of sections you could go to, right? So activity log, IAM tags, diagnose and solve problems, and locks. It really should start to kind of feel like it makes sense, right? Oh gosh, this is not something completely foreign. It doesn't look like completely different than every other Azure service, right? So
Yeah,
Cloud Simple had a separate portal for some of the management tasks.
right.
Everything's now in the ARM portal, the same ARM portal that you're using for everything else related to Azure.
And I think, again, back to that point earlier about, hey, I'm a developer, I need to have my API management instance in front of all those virtual machines or applications that are running on my VMware estate there. It just lowers that barrier, doesn't it? And it makes that just such a clean experience. I like it.
It does. And then I don't know if you're seeing everything over here. So this is
Mm.
that nice overview sort of essentials tab. So I've got 3 ESXi hosts deployed in my environment. This is the management VNet I used. So it's 10.5.0.0/22. All of this carving I did not do. I am not a networking person by trade. The deployment process carves that up for you and
Nice.
helps out related to subnetting, right? So you don't have to deal with it, which is awesome.
That's pretty cool.
So there's a section down here. So I think all of the AVS specific tasks start with manage.
Right.
So you're seeing here the vMotion network, and remember that's the vMotion using HCX as well as vMotion once your VMs live in AVS.
Sure.
So that'll happen on this network, the private cloud management network. Now, while I gave it a /22, it carved up and created a /26 for the management network.
Gotcha.
This is the express route circuit that wound up getting built with this environment. And then I chose, because I don't know about you, I like to be lazy every once in a while. I chose to have Microsoft do the express route authorization key. And I did that for this environment. So Microsoft did all of the peering. And I've played around with virtual WAN now. So I had to create a key and redeem it with this express route. So it's very straightforward though. You can, and it's kind of like, express route in general, but this is the express route that lives with AVS. So it's ever so slightly different. You're going into AVS, you're going into connectivity to handle some of those configuration tasks.
Gotcha.
This is HCX, so I'll show how you access the environment. So remember, it's somewhat in between IaaS and PaaS. You still need to have a virtual machine that can access the web, because all of this administration is done through it's HTML5 browser
Sure.
of the vSphere 6.7 era. So this is the IP range that they have provisioned for me, right, when I built out the service. And I'm building out some interesting stuff with HCX on-prem. So this is where you would get a key to enable your HCX environment to be deployed on premises. And remember, that would establish the tunneling between on premises and Azure over an express route circuit. So you could think about migrating your virtual machine into Azure using vMotion. Well, it's HCX enabled vMotion. That's probably the best way to describe it.
Gotcha.
If you wanted to think about expanding what you're doing with Azure Virtual WAN, you could internet enable it. I think, yeah, internet, it's disabled right now, but you could enable it and then configure your public IP.
Sure.
This is where you would be building out ExpressRoute Global Reach. So, this is where you would add global reach to your existing ExpressRoute circuits, and I don't have any in my subscription. But this is where you could tie it to, and then it's one less configuration step that you have to factor in. A lot of that happens behind the scenes once you hit create.
Nice. Yeah, I think again, right, just to make it super clear, everything that we've just been looking through is all just the type of thing you would expect to see in the Azure portal, and it's all just as easy, right? It's great.
I feel like it still gets folks a little anxious because you have to go into something new, but it's not like it's a lot of new stuff if you're familiar with VMware on-prem. So these are the login credentials. You'll get your web client URL, the admin user account, and Microsoft has chosen to lean on Cloud Admin. If you're more familiar with the on-premises world, think of that as like your administrator at vSphere.local. Cloud Admin's got different, I guess, controls inside of vSphere once it's inside of AVS. And then in order to get into your NSX-T environment, you'd go here, you'd lean on the admin account, and then the password here, it's abstracted. So the first iterations of AVS in this, we'll call it generation, and this iteration or this go round, you had to input a password and it had to be changed every 90 days. Now you don't have to. Microsoft will cycle that for you because it would require a support ticket. And I don't know if you're like most customers, putting a calendar reminder in to open up a support ticket every 90 days is probably an administrator's least favorite thing to do. So it's being cycled behind the scenes for customers, which is awesome.
Yeah, and that barrier is just going to make me not rotate my password, right? So that's a better way of doing it, I think.
Yeah, let's give that level of responsibility over to Microsoft.
Yep. Nice.
This is where you could add an additional cluster. Remember, you can only have 16 nodes in one cluster, but you can have up to 96 nodes in an Azure Private Cloud instance. You could add an additional cluster here. Okay. I can edit the amount of nodes. I can go up to 4 in my environment. Click out of there. I've got the opportunity to hit save, and in about 25 minutes, I'll have another node. I don't have a lot running on here, so I'm not going to choose to go that route. But 25 minutes, you've got another ESXi host.
And when
that's super fast.
When we say node, we're talking physical node again at that point, right?
Correct.
Yep.
Correct.
Nice.
Correct.
Cool. I mean, that's quite. So, I don't know about you, but I think that's quite quick. When you think of the time to get through a meeting with procurement, that would take longer than 25 minutes, let alone getting the infrastructure.
Waiting for the environment.
Exactly.
Yep. And then racking and stacking it, making sure it's got power, making sure it's on the right VLAN, making sure all of that's taken into consideration, and then building it. Now, building it doesn't take that long, but the idea of having Microsoft do this with a more automated fashion of spinning up kind of the fleet infrastructure that we run, you don't have to worry about it, right? It's allocated to you. And if you needed to add more than 4, let me go back in here, you would just need to request a quota increase. And I believe this link also takes you to, here, I'll make sure I think it takes you to, billing and support. So this is where you would get more info on what you would need to do in terms of adding additional hosts.
Awesome.
So it's kind of a cool reality. Now, remember how I had told you that customers adopted NSX-T to various different degrees, and there's no kind of one size fits all from a networking perspective?
Yeah.
So we've exposed NSX-T in the portal, and it's different from what we did with Cloud Simple, at least to what I've been told. I wasn't as involved with Cloud Simple, but we've exposed it in the portal. So if you're an admin that's not as familiar with NSX-T, you could go in and add a bunch of segments here and tie it to a gateway.
Nice.
Right? Without having to go into the NSX-T portal and maybe use some Google or some Bing foo to come up with the right way of configuring it. Because I feel like people are at various degrees of understanding how NSX-T works, right?
Yeah. And this is a nice middle of the road approach, I think, for that.
Agreed. And this is where some of that quote unquote secret sauce comes out, right? So the way that we've laid the portal over NSX-T and we've made some of those calls into the portal and rolled it in a little bit more seamlessly, I think that's where it gets interesting. So if you have environments that need a DHCP server or relay, this is where you could just add it. You don't even have to add it inside of NSX-T. You could tie it into your environment. Now, you do need to have that server up and functional inside of AVS, but you don't have to go and figure out the portal way of handling that within NSX-T. Because again, this is all web accessible in the vSphere land, right? Or vCenter land. Same with NSX-T, that's got kind of a portal of its own, right? But you don't have to go in there if you're not as familiar. You could just configure everything inside of the Azure Resource Manager portal.
Yeah.
You could think about building out VM groups, thinking about some port mirroring if you needed to troubleshoot networking. And then you could add DNS zones or a DNS service in here as well. So it starts to become more and more interesting, the ways in which the integrations are happening between AVS and the Azure Resource Manager portal.
So is this, when we say DNS zones, is that like the private DNS zones that we're used to in the Azure portal?
That would be like a private DNS zone. Like, so you need name resolution inside of AVS, right? Because it's still infrastructure. You still need identity the same way that you have on-prem.
Gotcha.
The best way to think about these VMs are kind of like either VMs on-prem or VMs that are kind of like IaaS. Again, they're not objects in the portal. If you spun up a VM on AVS, you're not going to see a VM, a NIC, an opportunity to put a public IP on there, right? The Azure Resource Manager portal has a number of different components that could make up a VM. The VM would only be seen inside of Azure VMware solution. So those VMs still need name resolution. And let's say you chose not to extend your domain or your DNS zones into Azure, you wanted to spin up a separate server, you could go so far as to register that DNS zone or the DNS service inside the simplified NSX interface. That's all showing up underneath here, which is kind of crazy.
Gotcha. So it's just, here's the machine on our local network of our VMware platform that actually is going to be hosting that DNS with you.
Right.
Makes sense. Awesome.
Exactly. So then these are other, components you would see in a regular Azure resource. So I won't spend too much time on that, but I think we're still doing pretty decent on time here. Why don't I go into what this looks like? So I've got a jump host behind an Azure Bastion service.
Just double checking. You're good for time?
I am good for time.
Cool. Good.
I am good for time. So I think this will round out pretty well in terms of showing what it looks like. See if I've got this up still. I can never remember my password, which is a good thing, I think, to admit, especially in a live stream.
Agreed.
I've got it in an Excel spreadsheet, though. I don't know if that's any better per se. I need to move it off the
I
Excel
use
spreadsheet.
LastPass for my stuff.
I know. I need to move some of so I have a lot of my personal stuff there, but I don't have like work passwords there. And
agreed.
Still kind of on the fence of, do I want to put it all in LastPass? I don't know. So I always encourage folks to reach out and tell me what they do, because I've heard a lot of folks who use 1Pass or 1Password, and Dashlane, I think, is another one I've heard people use. So I don't know. I get a little squirrely about work passwords. That's the only.
I'm with you on that one.
So let's go back into the AVS environment. Let's go down to identity, because remember, I don't know the password. I know that I'm using Cloud Admin.
Okay, right. So this is where we actually put it in. Got it.
Yeah. And this should look just like VMware. I've got a nice little alarm here that I was working on some HCX components. So what you'll see here, though, is it looks very simple. So I'll go to the home screen. It should look very familiar to any VMware admin out there, right? Got your hosted clusters, VMs and templates. You can see your storage, your networking, content libraries. That's where you could store your actual VM templates. You could place those on Azure Blob Storage. And again, the only way you would know it's not living on premises is things like northcentral.avs.azure.com. You could think about extending what you're doing with vRealize. So there's a lot of really savvy vRealize customers out there. That's an opportunity for automation, operations, monitoring, et cetera. So there is a bring your own key that's happening. I think it is ready. So if you are one of those customers and you are thinking about AVS, bring it up with your Microsoft account team, and they'll get you the latest and the greatest. I'm always a little farther removed from licensing conversations, but I know it is a bring your own license conversation. And then so this is HCX. This will bring you into the HCX portal where you configure your site pairings, right? And I've got that site pairing to an on-prem environment. This is where you build out your interconnects and you establish the tunnel. So remember, I was having some problems with this. So you create a compute profile, a network profile, and then create the service mesh. It did not work so hot, so I'm still trying to work through some networking snafus, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward on how to navigate through. Let's go back to hosts and clusters real quick here too. So, if you are a VMware admin, you're going to always get the make and the model of your server. So right now, we'll give Lisa Clark a shout out, I suppose, right? This is Dell EMC.
Absolutely.
But the reality is this might change in the future.
Yep.
You're not going to ever have to worry about the vendor hardware that Microsoft chooses for the solution. In fact, any upgrades, any maintenance, what winds up happening is another server sort of gets placed into the mix so that VMs can be moved onto that server, that temporary server, be motioned off there, and patching or upgrades can happen. Or maybe you even replace the server hardware. Something is completely wrong with that server. We have to completely replace it. It's an opportunity for Microsoft to use whatever they need to use in order to give you that hyper converged sort of node that you can still use. So you'll still see things like that where it will display just like it does on premises, but this could change in the future, right?
Yeah.
You're not the one that has to worry about, oh, I've got to get a hold of Dell, or oh, I have to get a hold of HP, and oh, I have to deal with the maintenance and the contract support. So when you spin this up, you get vCenter, NSX-T, HCX, and vSAN as part of the solution that's baked into the overall cost, as well as the express route circuit. Nice. Now, if you're looking at the pricing calculator, it looks pretty expensive. Know that you can also use reserved instances to reduce the cost, and it saves you anywhere between 30 and 50% of your overall savings on a month-by-month basis. So if you feel like this might be around for a long period of time, you could think about a 3-year reserved instance. You could even think about a 1-year reserved instance if you're just trying to figure out, where are we going to be 12 months from now? Let's be honest, the last 12 months have been weird. So who knows what the next 12 months are going to mean, Yep. So you could just think about being more conservative and hedging and going with a 1-year reserved instance, or you could go with a 3-year. And then remember, your Azure hybrid use benefit licensing applies here as well. On top of the fact that if you're running legacy-based OSs, meaning you're still in the 2008 R2 era, whether that be Windows or SQL, you could migrate those older OSs into AVS and not have to pay for the extended security updates. So those are some extra features here that start to make this even more compelling, especially if you have, looks like my boss calls it technical excellence, and you have a fairly big environment, but you're just trying to make sense of how do we break this apart and move this faster into Azure. So Azure VMware Solution becomes that faster way to accelerate your journey into cloud.
Yeah, no, I love this. I've seen the vSphere client portal here. I can't remember when. As I mentioned, I'm not really the the infrastructure guru or the VMware guru here, but I know enough that I've seen this portal and that I recognize this, and this looks familiar to what I saw before, right? And I'm sure for others,
and you're developers, so it looks familiar to you, which should look even more familiar, right?
Exactly, and that's my point. Yeah, is that for those who have been doing this day in day out, I can only imagine the sigh of relief that they're exhaling right now, looking at this, going, "Okay, this doesn't look so scary and so different." So no, this has been awesome.
Yeah, it starts to lessen that overall anxiety. It starts to stop out with I always joke, I call it analysis by paralysis.
Yep.
The customers that want to make sure they know everything is ready to go. It's like for like. As you know, it's hard to get like for like because we've literally lived in a VMware world on premises for forever. And we've got everything so uniquely coupled into vSphere as it stands. So being able to extend that and move it into Azure starts to help with some of those operational standards that you want to adhere to as you think about a transition into Azure.
Absolutely. Awesome. No, that's been great. Good. I think we've well and truly covered Azure VMware solutions here on Azure, and I've certainly learned a lot. I knew a lot more than I did about an hour ago, so thank you for educating me and teaching me here. It's been awesome.
Totally. And to your viewers, if anybody has questions or wants to dig in more, I'm very accessible on Twitter, very accessible on LinkedIn. Drop me a line if you've got questions. If you want to be connected with Microsoft people, I can kind of help you out on that front. I'm the one that's out there kind of championing the service. So I know the people that are involved, but I'm not the one that would be involved with your specific company's transformation. But I get you connected with the right people, and I can always help out and give you ideas and things of that sort. So it gets interesting seeing how this product will evolve and mature over time.
Awesome. Now, Shannon, just once again, thank you so much. I think that's been an
Sure.
awesome session. And I think for anyone who may be listening back or watching back as well, if you do like Bicep, if you have been looking at the templates, definitely get in touch as well. There's a call to action there,
Yeah.
folks.
Yeah. Because I have not played around with it, and arguably I spent a lot of time in ARM templates, and I feel like I know ARM templates very well. I just haven't had enough time to focus on Bicep, and that shows you how busy our days can get at Microsoft, right?
Absolutely. Excellent.
So
Cool. Shannon, thank you for the great session. And I'm sure
thanks for having
we'll
me.
find another excuse to get you on again.
Yeah, exactly. We'll figure something out. You and I
Absolutely.
will, and then I'm starting to build out a show as well, so I'm going to be bugging you for that.
For
So you'll
sure.
start to see, I think, more activity on probably both fronts. Let's be honest, right?
Look forward to it.
Sprinkle that early enough, right?
Absolutely. Look forward to it. I look forward to the invite. Excellent.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks, Shannon.
All right, take care.
So there we go, folks. We have been looking all at Azure VMware Solutions, VMware, and I really wasn't lying at the beginning there, right? You can probably tell by some of the questions that I asked there just how little I knew to begin with. But Shannon did a great job there explaining all about Azure VMware Solutions, the idea behind it, some of the architectural pieces as well, and some of the prerequisites to get you going on your journey there. So you know what to do. If you have liked this session, please go ahead, hit that like button so that we know you like the content and we can do more of it. Hit the subscribe button so you can keep up to date with what's coming out, and the notification bell so you know as soon as there is brand new content for you to go and listen to or watch as well. And speaking of listening to, we're not just on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and cloudwithchris.com, where you can go ahead, listen, as well as reading the transcript in real time. If you don't want to listen, you don't want to watch, you can even read blogs as well over on cloudwithchris.com. So there is content for you no matter how you like to consume. So thank you again for tuning in. Really appreciate the support, and great session from Shannon there as well. So we will absolutely find an excuse to get her onto the show again. But until the next time, folks, stay safe, stay healthy, and bye for now.